Feel free to jump in through SO's mic if you want. I'm talking to Douglas. Yes. All right. It says we're live. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's. Oh crap! I just realized I forgot to get rid of the 20-second buffer. Crap. Okay, we'll be fine. So, anyways, yeah, we have actually kind of two things we wanted to talk about. First off is going to be, well, the video, but, well, before we get into that, I was talking with Esso before, and if you've been to Backalley, you might have heard me mention this once or twice. But, I mean, in the last couple days, we've been really shifting our focus in terms of subversive narratives away from Hoppianism. Not to say that Hoppianism isn't something that should be discussed. It's just sort of like we've kind of beaten that horse to death, and going much further doesn't really seem to be terribly necessary. We'll probably talk about it more in the future as time goes on, but at the moment, we've shifted our focus away from Hoppianism towards subjectivism, which, to put it succinctly, do you want to explain it? Oh crap! Give me a second here. They can't hear you. All right, try to say something.
Hello
All
in
right,
the
there we
chat room.
go. Yeah, that's probably why everyone in the chat was saying that they couldn't hear you.
All right.
I do apologize. We were just having a few audio troubles. So just to, do you mind if I sum up what you said just a few seconds ago?
Yeah, that would help quite a bit
Yeah,
because I was talking for like a minute.
yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. So basically, what Esso is saying is that that they're in fields of science, and especially in philosophy, there's a certain idea that all claims about those fields of science are all equally true. So in the fields of philosophy, you have egoism, you have consequentialism that argue that there is no such thing as an objective truth claim that has any superior explanatory power to any others.
Yeah, and what I was getting into while you couldn't hear me is that the way that these approaches to study attempt to build themselves is that they are rebuttals to a particular way of approaching that type of study. In the case of ethical relativism, they claim that it's a rebuttal to the notion that there is such a thing as a study of ethics. But the problem is that these relativistic arguments, because they still build themselves in the case of ethical philosophy, it's why I gave a particular example. If they are arguing that this particular concept um, is relative, what they can't actually make that position because by framing their argument as something that's under the umbrella of ethical philosophy, what they're doing is making a truth claim about what ethical truth actually is, which is paradoxical. A more accurate way to characterize the relativist position is that all claims are equal in explanatory power.
All right. And so, in my attempts to refute people who try to put forward relativism or subjectivism as some sort of truth claim about reality, I've come up with an argument that I think does a pretty good job of refuting the subjectivist argument quite thoroughly. And I don't believe I'm the first one to come up with this. I've seen variations from other philosophers make it as well, but I think I'm really the first one to put this much work into explaining how it is that this argument can be so powerful and have such explanatory power. And that is just with a simple three-word statement: subjectivism is false. Subjectivism is false is, of course, a truth claim about subjectivism being, untrue, and therefore all of its presuppositions, all of its arguments, and all of its conclusions are therefore invalid, and other explanations about the nature of science and other scientific and philosophical fields must therefore be explored. Now, what makes the statement subjectivism is false particularly interesting is that there is no possibility of a subjectivist to be able to refute that statement without either affirming that the statement subjectivism is false is true, or without refuting the field of subjectivism entirely. So it's effectively a Boolean statement. If subjectivism is false, then well, subjectivism is false. If subjectivism is true, which they might try to assert, then they therefore must refute subjectivism by saying that it is objectively true that subjectivism is false, therefore, well, subjectivism must be false. If they attempt to reject the premise of the question entirely through one of two ways, either by attempting to claim that subjectivism is sometimes true or sometimes false, then they must necessarily again fall into that same trap of refuting the field of subjectivism entirely, because they must make an objective statement that subjectivism is false is objectively not true, which of course is a
And
paradox. It falls afoul of the consistency principle, and therefore it simply affirms the original statement that subjectivism is false. The only other way I can think of that they could possibly try to refute it is to reject the Boolean entirely and just claim that the question is, through some circumstances or some field, it's invalid. It's an invalid question in some way. Now, how they would do this, I'm not sure. I'm sure you could conceive of an infinite variety of ways that they could do this. However, it still falls into the same problem of needing to objectively affirm that the statement subjectivism is false is therefore, well, affirming the original statement. They can't help but fall into a whole bunch of paradoxes in attempting to refute the statement. I'm referring to this as Heretic's paradox, if you don't mind me stroking my ego a little bit there. But the whole point of
okay.
the but the whole point of Heretic's paradox is just to point out that subjectivism is false, cannot be refuted by a subjectivist.
And the only objection I would have is that you're using the terms subjectivism and relativism synonymously when they're not describing the same thing. For instance, marginal utility is a type of subjectivism, but it's not claiming that principles are relative. It is a tangible it is a tangible rebuttal to concepts which attempt to frame certain economic principles as though they have some sort of intrinsic objectiveness, and it's arguing using using certain logic structures and principles of coherence, like um, the law of consistency. It's using these sort of objectively demonstrable axioms and principles to argue that this is definitively how certain things about nature work, and that's not relativistic. So I just wanted to clarify that there's a difference between subjectivism and relativism.
That's fair. I just think it's worth putting this forward because I'll probably be exploring this idea in a bit more detail. I haven't really like solidified it just yet. It's still something I'm working through. So yeah, it's a good thing that that's being pointed out because well, yeah. Beyond that, I don't really have much more to say. Do you?
No, I don't. I think though, and we've been kind of hinting about this in past streams, but we are eventually planning on making at least an essay with at least one part about relativism, and we're not just going to be talking about relativism as it's found in the libertarian movement or the among quote unquote libertarians. We're talking about relativistic approaches to study altogether because they're kind of plaguing mainstream science. And trouble is actually identifying these relativistic stances because there are some stances like moral naturalism, for instance, or Boolean logic, which attempt to frame themselves as though they're making a sort of conceptual claim about certain aspects of what we're observing, but in reality, they don't have any sort of basis for their principles, and as a result, they are relativistic if taken to their logical conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the chat right now. And Omen Rose, I did not see that video by Overly Sarcastic Productions on ancient philosophers. I don't know. I don't really follow them. There's a lot of YouTubers that I don't watch, so that's not terribly surprising. But other than that, like
And
I don't really have much more to add. I think we can just get into the video.
ancient philosophy can be summarized in one sentence. Aristotle was right, and anyone who says otherwise is a shill.
Yeah,
I'm
pretty
just
much.
all
the
right.
the triumph of Platonism has been a tragedy to humanity, and hopefully we'll be fixing
Yeah,
that in the not too distant future.
and
So
that would be a great example of approaches to study methodologies which are innately relativistic, but if you look at them from a superficial perspective, they don't appear relativistic. That being those which are based on Platonic types of logic.
oh, Esso, don't you know that Platonism isn't relativistic at all? In fact, it's an objective field of scientific study that's attempting to figure out the objectivity of things as they exist in another dimension. Therefore, it's an objective field of science.
And of course, these principles and axioms could never be demonstrated or tested specifically because they're based on the notion that there's just some abstract that vaguely exists and that nobody could test. Sounds
Oh,
relativistic to me.
Owen Rose said that they being overly sarcastic productions, said Aristotle was stupid and Plato was right.
That's might have to be doing a response to that actually.
That might be actually worth a video. Might be worth a stream on because yeah, that's. I mean, I don't know
That's
what
a
to make
hot
of
take.
that. Anyways, yeah, should we start with the video because we're 15 minutes in?
Yeah, sure. We haven't introduced our video that we're going to be responding to today.
Okay, so let me see here. This is the School of Life. They have way too many YouTube, or they have way too many subscribers for what they do. I'm actually, I said before, I don't really follow that many YouTubers, so I've only heard about these guys maybe once or twice. I assume that they're one of those like education channels that that is run entirely by social democrats, and as a result, they're probably like
Yeah,
very
they're
favored in
one
the algorithm.
yeah, they're one of those they're one of those channels that attempts to explain philosophical concepts or certain quote unquote ideologies in like 5 minutes or less, except they don't, they don't actually say that. It's just a very basic explanation of what these philosophies are without ever actually going into whether or not they're justified, how they're justified, what it means to a much more nuanced extent, and why exactly they would explain reality. So it's in concept they're supposed to be like basic philosophy, but yeah, the problem is that there really isn't such a thing as a non-controversial approach to explaining these philosophical ideas. And that's the more that you simplify, the more you have to presuppose certain aspects of how you're framing the discussion, or how you're even characterizing the general subject that what you're talking about is attempting to provide an explanation for. And that's sort of I guess that's the reason why it takes me like 30 to 40 minutes to make these sort of basic explanations. It's because they are basic explanations. It's just that you can't presuppose things when you're attempting to actually explain the nature of how something works. You have to actually explain the mechanisms, and you have to demonstrate why it explains more than other attempts to show how it works.
As the more I learn, the more I realize that these kinds of basic summations that a lot of these YouTubers try to make in explaining certain ideas, I mean, I get why they exist, but on the other hand, they also miss out on some very important information in regards to facts, logic, correctness, and, as you said yourself, justification. That when people are trying to be more efficient in learning philosophy, so they'll look up a 5 minute explanatory video rather than, go through the rigorous attempt of figuring out for themselves, or watching a 2 or 3 hour lecture on the subject that goes into great detail. There's going to be a lot of information about the justification that's lost. And when you don't have the justification, when you don't have context, when you don't have a lot of the relevance that this has, either in reality or in people's lives, then a lot of it just comes off as a triviality, something that's largely unimportant. And as a result, well, you're going to end up making this whole thing seem dry and high in the sky, like cloud in the or head in the clouds, disconnected from reality. And
More
I think that's honestly very tragic, because if even people were slightly more interested in philosophy, I would imagine that the world would be significantly different than it is today. Especially since more people would realize, yeah, the state freaking sucks.
Well, among other things, they would understand sort of why it's important to understand the world around them, and how it actually does matter to them. And that's what I was going to say, is the mentality behind simplifying philosophies or methodologies within scientific study seems to be that if you simplify them, it will make it easier for people to understand. But in simplifying them, you have to leave out a lot of the explanations of the nuances regarding that particular methodology or that area of study. And in doing so, you make it more difficult for people to understand. All that Esso's paradox, since you coined Heretic's paradox.
That's fine. That's fine. Anyways, yeah, I think we should get into the video real quick. Like you can see on the title on the screen, "How to Improve Capitalism." You can already tell since they're adopting that incredibly popular anti-concept that this is not someone who really has people's best interests at heart, and more along the lines of
Oh,
having their own personal marginal interests in regards to how the government ought to coerce people into models of organization that they personally prefer would be in or how it would be in their interests.
and yeah, you could tell by the title more than anything. The title of this video that we're talking about today, which by the way, you should send me the watch together link because I haven't gotten one.
Wait, I
But
haven't.
no, you haven't sent it to me.
I could have sworn I did.
But you, you could tell by the title of the video the sort of exactly the problem that I was just talking about earlier. Where in trying to simplify what they're arguing, they have to assume a bunch of things that they haven't justified. Um, what do they mean by capitalism? Uh, what do they mean by improving capitalism? This assumes a whole bunch of things, particularly I'm focusing on the word improve in the title because that assumes a whole bunch of things about like the nature of the state, what an economy is, um, what exactly the state does in society, what a society is, how conventions in society are formed, and this isn't just something that's in the title, of course. This is spoiler alert, I guess, but that's actually going to be a very rampant problem throughout the video. But I guess since I don't really have anything left to sort of provide in terms of pretext, we can just get started here. Get the watch together tab open. All right. Well, it hasn't. Okay, yeah, I've got it.
It's clear capitalism doesn't work
It
very
doesn't.
well
If
at the
you started
moment.
playing the
But most of
video, I haven't seen it on my end yet.
It's clear capitalism doesn't work very well at the moment, but most of us feel there isn't anything to be done. We're stuck with it because there's
What does that mean? I mean,
I believe they're using a very simplified term to describe something functioning. In other words, you could just replace the word "it's not working" with "it's not functioning as intended."
but that just gets that gets back to what I've been saying for the last couple minutes. We're assuming that economies are like systems that exist outside of the people who are operating within them. Likewise with societies, and no, every neighborhood has a different economy. Every household has a different economy. What are we talking about? Why does why does capitalism, as a sort of political attempt to define the economy, why is that a valid way of looking at this?
I think this is largely what happens when you build your philosophy on the basis of, or when your analysis of how economies, how societies, just when your sociological perspective, to put it more simply, is based on relativism, where you just analyze the systems of organization and then you treat them as though they were external to how people actually associate, and don't realize that economies, societies, and culture are an entirely spontaneous phenomenon of human interaction and human action, and aren't just things that exist parallel to, over, below, whatever, to these groups of people.
I mean, just aside from, and yeah, not even really getting into the conceptual problems with talking about capitalism and then trying to extrapolate that onto like literally anything that anyone does at any time in associating with one another, or even more insidiously, assuming that every association that people make with one another is characterized by like the political, the policies enforced by the state, and how specifically the state chooses to use force to influence society around them. That's more fundamentally the problem here. Is they're assuming that the economy is the same thing as all economies are the same thing as the political economy. The political economy being the market framework, which the state has attempted to characterize through legislative fiat. So basically, the idea of like a national economy, in other words, to be seen the same way. This is not born out of market-driven incentives. This is born out of social engineering and threats of violence.
From this point onward, it should be blatantly obvious that these are the kinds of technocrats that I've talked about in previous videos, as well as previous streams, that emerged during the 20s, 30s, and 40s out of the Fabian socialist movement from earlier in that century. The whole thing is this belief that society is something that can be engineered, controlled, manufactured, and administrated by central planners, and all completely scientifically. And if they could just get the right people, the right administrators, the right experts to just engineer everything, then everything would be absolutely perfect. It's what Adam Smith referred to as the man of system, the person with the absolute most beautiful, well-designed blueprint in regarding how people should organize, who should do what, how many of certain things ought to work, and this blueprint that they have is just beautiful. But the main problem, of course, is the man of system will very quickly recognize that people are not just pieces on a chessboard to be moved about and arranged as they see fit. They are individual actors like the man of system themselves, with their own individual interests, autonomy, their own individual action. They will not always act in ways the central planner, the man of system, wants them to act. And this is going to make any sort of central planning system, it's going to fall apart very quickly. Now, this idea of that it can just be improved, that capitalism is not working, well, first off, they will never define capitalism. They just assume that you know what it means. And they don't know, just to be clear, they don't know what it means either. Nobody does. But this idea that capitalism doesn't work can be, when you realize that economies are a spontaneous phenomenon of human action, assuming the absence of externalities like the states that enable social engineering like this to take place, you would quickly figure out. Sorry, I wasn't quite finished. You would quickly realize that capitalism not working can very easily just be substituted to just say people are, or groups of people are acting in ways we disapprove of.
Or it could be interpreted to argue that from the central planner's perspective, this particular political economy is not working, and as we're going to go on to see, that's exactly what the School of Life Fellow is talking about. But as Heretic has basically demonstrated, it's incoherent to see economies as models you can construct, because what economies consist of is people acting among one another. So it's clearly a social study, and something that is completely uncontroversial, even by the so-called empiricists, is that it's not really possible to engineer. It's not really possible to engineer models that prescribe human behavior. Unless you're like one of those crazy hard determinist types that nobody would take seriously anyway.
Well, even then, like you'll find very quickly that a lot of hard determinists are relativists also. So they're not really
Of
going to
course,
be they're not usually
yeah.
going to be the kind of people you want to have any serious discussion with. Anyways, I'm just going to back up a few seconds, and yeah, let's continue.
What I was
There
gonna
isn't
say.
anything to
Just what I
be
was gonna say
done
is,
with
yeah,
stuff.
of course, determinists are also going to be relativists because relativism, for the viewers who are watching this stream, if you haven't been able to gather now, is more or less just an excuse for ideas that otherwise wouldn't be able to stand on their merit. It's not actually a methodology in science. It's a slippery rhetorical tactic to try and make it seem as though you're not justified in questioning their unjustifiable positions.
I'm still pretty convinced that the study of relativism in general is largely a result of people failing science class in government schools and then them just looking for some excuse to seem profound and intelligent in
Oh,
their inability to understand some very basic concepts.
another a possibility, and I think that this one's more likely, is just that these people have vices or like a very unnatural, unhealthy view of the world that they can't really get over. And instead of like addressing it as a, because they have some sort of deeply rooted personal problem, and instead of addressing it and doing something to try and work around it, they engage in relativism as a way to try and justify their outlook of the world because yeah, that not just as far as ethical relativism goes. Pretty much every relativist that I've run into, we've been able more or less in some instances to have civil discussions, but I mean to one extent or another, they're always like the most like toxic, disgusting, truly fucking down to the point where they're like literally submental scum to where I've never actually met a person worse in real life than that. They're all some form of relativist. So I think that if you look at what relativism is, it's not entirely surprising that this is a notable trend among those types of people, given that what relativism asserts is just that everything has equal explanatory power to anything else. And that just sounds like a psychotic person's justification for being psychotic.
All right. Anyways, let's continue here.
With it because there's just no alternative. That's nonsense. There are plenty of good, workable suggestions for reform, and here are 4 of them.
Suggestions for reform.
Well, along the lines of imperial dictates for central planning. There's really not going to be much
Always,
else to this.
always peeves me. Just what I was gonna say is it always peeves me when statists talk about they refer to laws as suggestions. That's something that's always got under my skin, even back when I was a statist.
I'm going to point a gun at your face and I'm going to suggest that you give me your wallet. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, I'm sure I'm pointing a gun at you and asking you to do so under the implicit assumption that if you fail to give me your wallet, then I'm just going to kill you and take it anyway. But I mean, I'm not. It's just a suggestion. It's completely different.
But also, to characterize laws as suggestions also carries a whole bunch of absolutely nonsensical entailments about what the state is. Mainly that the state doesn't use force to limit possibilities, to limit resources, or to prop up certain practices or people who otherwise wouldn't be able to continue functioning the way that they are. It's just it's some sort of third party neutral group that suggests people stop doing things, and that's it's of course a very disingenuous rhetorical tactic, and like even when I was a statist, I thought that was kind of sus because that's obviously not what the state does.
But
When it decrees something, it is not like suggesting, "Hey, cut that out." It's not working as some sort of like guidebook. They're pointing guns at people and saying, "If you don't do this, we will kill you."
But Esso, the government, the state is just us. It's we the people. It says so in this piece of paper. So therefore, we're pointing guns at ourselves and commanding ourselves to do things.
Yeah, that being one of the major assumptions that's kind of implied by referring to laws as suggestions. But then there's also the concept of reform, which refer to our previous criticisms about just assuming that all economies are political economies and all of them are characterized by the mandates of the state.
All right. Anyways, let's continue. And I just switched my audio around, so because I have a feeling I was picking up a little bit too much background noise.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, you're fine. I was just switching my audio.
Okay.
We have to bear in mind that capitalism isn't just one thing. There are almost as many varieties of capitalism as there are capitalist countries. There are American, German, Singaporean, Swedish, Danish, Korean versions of the thing. The differences include the size of the welfare state, from around 10% of GDP in Korea to over 30% in Finland.
Imagine
Size of
thinking
the welfare state.
Imagine thinking that the welfare state is in any way an aspect of an economy. I mean,
And
it
also,
strictly speaking, it is, but it's mostly just like some tacked on thing that is mandated to exist by imperial decree. And
and yeah, so I apologize if we're not going to be responding to every instance where this person uses either slippery rhetorical tactics or is saying something that carries like a presumption about the nature of another aspect of study that they haven't justified. We've pointed that out, and we're going like every time that they do that, like every specific instance where they make that specific rhetorical slip or they attempt to make that sort of presupposition. We're going to call it out, but we're not going to stop them every time that they do that. I just wanted to mention that because something that something that has caught my attention is how fast the narrator is talking, just
well,
kind of overloading the viewer with information. So I wanted the people watching to know, yeah, we're not getting gish galloped. It's just that it's because that's what the narrator appears to be trying to do. It's not really working on me. It's just that a lot of the problems are going to be sort of repeat problems, and we're not going to stop every time to address them.
oh god, yeah. I imagine like we'll get halfway through. I imagine, well, we actually probably won't get halfway through the video since Friday streams are always short. But I imagine that if we were to go halfway to the video, that we kind of have to stop there because at that point we'd just be going over points that we've already addressed. But yeah, I mean, there's not really much to say about the welfare state. That's not to say that welfare would not exist at all in an economy absent government coercion. It's just that it would be more on the lines of mutual aid rather than the kind of uh, income redistribution mandated by or mandated by coercive monopolies. Which is, of course,
And we
the
don't
the coercive monopoly aspect is what they mean by welfare, not mutual aid.
I mean, I don't know necessarily. I guess it would depend on the economy we're talking about, which model would sort of pick up as a substitute for the absence of the welfare state. But the idea that there was no like what statists would refer to as the social safety net, prior to the existence of welfare states is absurd. And if you actually look at the history of these welfare programs being legislated by the state, such as with the case of healthcare mandates, they actually were created specifically to slight the mutual aid organizations we were talking about previously,
And
as a way
welfare.
to try and make people more dependent on the state and the state's pharmaceutical cartels, and to try and make it so they can't trade among people can't trade among themselves at cheaply for healthcare.
And there's also the aspect to which the welfare state is a subsidy for big companies to be able to give lower wages, because now that workers can just go on welfare and get the supplemental incomes they need to sustain their lives, they have less of an interest in demanding higher wages from potential employers, and this creates a depressing effect on wages. In
Well,
their absence,
they haven't argued yet that the welfare state is like a bolster to the non-political actors, but I guess we covered that before they did inevitably make that argument, because I haven't watched the entire video, but I suspect that at some point they're going to try and more or less argue that. So we nip that in the bud right away. They're assuming that the welfare system exists to subsidize poor people. And I suppose that to an extent that's true, but the ultimate effect of doing that is de facto creating a type of subsidy for big business.
all right. Anyways, let's hit continue.
The importance of state-owned enterprises, producing less than 1% of GDP in the US, but 22% of GDP in Singapore, and the power of trade unions, with nearly 70% of workers unionized in Norway and only about 10% in the US.
Okay, hold on. Something that I'd like to go over first of all is they're sort of demonstrating exactly why the concept of of trying to characterize all economic activity based on like the state's national economy, or what it says is its national economy, is really dumb. Because if you look at the Scandinavian models, what he's referring to more or less, the reason that some of them, like the way that some of their quote unquote welfare systems are characterized, is by the amount of international trade that's able to that's able to be sort of cartelized by those states, because they don't have many natural exports, and the ones that they do don't have a lot of demand on the international markets, at least that can't be fulfilled by other parts of the world. So that's something that has been extensively argued, that the reason these these Scandinavian countries are able to have more welfare is because more people within them can more people within them are essentially making more resources, because their trade is not as centrally managed by the states, or at least I guess a better way of characterizing that is the policies are more directed at just subsidizing certain business partners, as opposed to actively restricting trade elsewhere. And just because so much actual trade occurs, the sort of privilege that the political partners at the top of their economies receive is enough to sort of keep the other the other smaller white market firms down. But now I guess on to the this statement about unions. Well, we're sort of assuming that all unions are political unions, and I guess we've talked about that previously, particularly the last stream, where initially unions started as a counter economic response specifically to regulations the state began legislating, which made it so people essentially had less bargaining leverage over their own pay rates and over who they could or couldn't work for. So when we're talking about political unions, we have to understand that political unions are not the only type of union model that exists. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about union representation? The political economy, I mean, because that's I would imagine if you were to look up these figures, which by the way, we haven't even gotten into questioning the figures, but I'd imagine if you did, since this is really the only effective way to gather numbers like that, you would be able to find unions that the state recognizes as unions, working for firms the state recognizes as firms, which, by the way, is another problem with trying to create political models. Not all of the actual market transactions that are being engaged in are actually communicated to the state. There's a lot of counter economists who need, in order to continue being counter economists, for the state to not know that they're doing what they're doing.
Something. I'm sorry if I'm not saying anything, but something's going on around me that I'm not entirely sure what it is. It's kind of distracting. But onto the subject of unions, I do know that, well, at least in the United States, that 10% figure they used is not correct. The actual number of union labor in the United States is around 7%, which is actually remarkably low when you consider that in many trades and in many places in the United States, it is illegal to do your job or be employed in a given profession without being a part of a union. It's a thing called agency shop, and yeah, there has been a little bit of pushback against that in so-called right-to-work states, which have passed legislation to repeal the idea of agency shop, but it's primarily a one of those marginal partisan issues that one party prefers, the other one doesn't. And yeah, it's just a whole mess. I know that, for example, I know that in Texas, the state I work in, that you need to be a member of one of two or three unions to be able to work as an electrician, for example. And I'm sure the same is true in a lot of other places. And this doesn't even go into things like licensing and that do otherwise restrict the supply of people into a given trade in order to make it significantly more expensive. And we could go into example after example after example where this is the case. But I think it suffices to point out that, yeah, the the union situation is pretty freaking tricky. So with this in mind, should we continue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we
All
can
right.
talk more about unions later.
All right.
Has got dials, and we can adjust them.
It's got dials, and we can adjust them.
Yeah,
As
this is what I was referring to earlier, where they just make it explicitly obvious that their idea of an economy is literally they're using terms which liken it to being a machine, where you just have you have controls that can prescribe how certain things work, and to get the machine functioning, you presumably have to turn the mechanisms a certain way.
hmm It's just the same idea that I was talking about earlier in regards to the technocracy of the 1930s and 1940s. That society, culture, and economy is just something that can be altered, switched, calibrated by central planners and overseen by administrators. And if you just have everything right, if you just have the right mathematical formulas to be able to decide human action or prescribe, I should say, human action, then everything will just be great, wonderful, and perfect. I promise. Anyway, should we continue?
And Sure, but I was going to say that the problem with this sort of prescriptive view of economies, and I'd mentioned this earlier, that the study of markets necessarily is a social study, but one of the implications of it being a social study is that you have inputs that are being sort of registered by individual people that are based, and while individual people are logical in their thinking and may be rational, um they may understand sort of the objective truth. People are not themselves these walking logic calculators. And it's funny we're making this criticism towards them because oftentimes that is that's a misinformed criticism of the Austrians made by central planners when it started off actually as an Austrian criticism of the mainstream approach to econ. But yeah, people are not logical. They do not have all of the broader information available to them. So they operate around, more importantly, subjectively informed interpretations of what their own interests are. So the only real way that you can actually observe trends in this particular area of interest as a science is as an outside neutral observer, because any attempt to create like proprietors and to cartelize areas of the market and then like prescribe, say, interest rates or how supply of new resources enter the market, or to curb the resources that are in the market, that will result in people having to invest their resources and act in pursuit of lesser valued preferences to compensate, which creates distortions because people invest around the assumption that these other resources exist in greater abundance than what's actually demanded, or in greater abundance than what actually exists. So if you try, you basically you can't prescribe any aspect of the market. That's going to just result in the whole thing collapsing. And this has been somewhat controversial for some reason, but this doesn't just apply to the government. This applies in general to any aspect of the market, any particular industry. If you were to have like an industry guild, a central bank, or you were to have these supply cartels on the international markets prescribe rates like they do, that innately creates distortions.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add to that. Sorry if I'm being quiet today. It's just that right now there's a lot of noise in the background. It's fairly distracting. So, anyways, I'm
Uh,
just going to
what's
continue.
going on in the background?
Someone's playing frickin' music!
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm surprised anyone can't hear it and isn't commenting about it in the chat. Anyways.
I can't
But
hear
Sweden,
anything.
that supposedly high tax addicted country, only introduced income tax in 1932, 2 decades after the US and nearly a century after Britain. Or remember that the US, that pro-rich place today, had a top income tax rate of 91% between 1950 and 1963.
That's
And it didn't do
factually
them much harm
inaccurate.
at all.
What they said at the end, that it hardly did any harm at all. While it is true that on paper the U.S. had a tax rate as high as 91%, the number of people who actually paid that amount could be counted on an amputated hand. In other words, nobody paid it, and the whole thing is just an entirely canard. It's something that I've been seeing people throwing around like for over a decade, even long before I became an anarchist. A lot of pro-government, technocratic central planning types want to just say that 91% income taxes, and that we had the biggest economic boom in history. So if we just have a 91% income tax again, everything will be great and wonderful and perfect. I freaking hell, I say that phrase a
Well,
lot. But the
considering that
idea, But they say
All
that
right.
and they don't explain any sort of context as to why that existed and who actually paid it. If you do get them to go into detail, they do admit that the actual number of people who were subject to that 91% tax was literally 4 people. And even they didn't pay it because they had so many ways and workarounds and exemptions that the actual rate was, well, I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but it was hardly anything close to 91%. So this whole thing is just absolutely freaking deceptive.
And this is sort of what I was about to say. This is another problem when with having discussions about like a policy oriented view of economic theory. I have never been given an explanation that is even remotely logically consistent for how limiting resources increases the abundance of resources. Using force to stop people from having resources somehow creates an abundance of them. The closest that I've heard is the money multiplier argument from the Keynesians, but of course that's nonsense, as Mises referred to it. It's the science of turning stone into gold.
Well, I mean,
It just
we can talk to the alchemists about how successful their attempt at turning stones and water into gold was, but suffice to say, it's not going to be terribly effective.
basic long story short, any argument which it's telling that any argument which actually makes this point uses GDP as as their figure of measurement, because GDP is the favorite, or like stock figures are another one that they love. GDP and stock figures are the favorite among the economic pseudoscientists because they're the easiest to manipulate by mandate. GDP increases just based on spending. So, the famous example provided by Bastiat is you break a window, that person, spends money to replace the window. They don't have more wealth. They don't have more resources, but the GDP increases.
Hmm.
Um, stock figures, those could be manipulated through central bank mandates and through the sort of cartels on trade internationally, because they can sort of control how, within a political framework, who has sort of dibs on resources when they first enter a particular nation's economy. So, those could be very easily manipulated through geopolitical fuckery, and that's in short. Keynesian site don't understand generally that you cannot use GDP as a measurement of prosperity, which is why they think that money exchanging more hands somehow means that there's a greater abundance of purchasing power attributed to the money in question.
Although I think I figured out, well, just a quick thing on manipulating stocks. Another way that companies are able to do that to manipulate their stock value is, well, lay off employees. Because there's always a perception of downsizing, and if they can do that, if they can lay off 100, 1,000, or even 100, or even 10,000 employees, there's a perception of streamlining going on. Their stock value is going to increase. I know Disney's been doing that quite a lot lately to maintain their failing company. But
They
anyways,
also they can use they can count double spending on their financial returns to create the impression that more resources are being created than I mean, more wealth is being created than there actually is. The example you've provided on past streams with Disney again, but there are other companies that do this, is counting gift cards, the purchasing of gift cards, but then also the credit used. Um, that was spent by people who purchased gift cards previously, they count both on their financial returns. So somebody buys a $50 gift card. Not only would Disney count the $50, but they would also count the $50 in credit that was spent on Disney products. So they would count $100 on their financial returns.
Yeah, it's absolutely fraudulent. But one thing I did notice throughout this video, at least as briefly as I watched it, is that their description of the economy and society as something that is external to society and something that is placed on top of it, while it's not true of the economy and society itself, it is true of the government. And with this understanding, we can see that a lot of what they're trying to do, their policy prescriptions, are based entirely upon the assumption that this entity that does exist external of society, this or the government, is able to do these things. If you substitute capitalism with the government, the point that they're trying to make, it does actually start to make a lot more sense, and it starts to become slightly more coherent. It's still
Yeah,
it's still technocratic central planning garbage, but at least it's kind of sensical.
I've argued this about mainstream econ generally, but Keynesians and monetarists more specifically. That that's. I'm glad that you mentioned that because yes, they are talking about the economy as something that's like imposed by the state, and yeah, when you look at the economy as pursuing the interests of the state's political partners and the state itself, then the Keynesian or just generally mainstream analysis begins to make more sense because they're not talking, they see wealth creation, or at least they're attempting to conflate wealth creation with resources appropriated by the state and the state having the ability to manage resources more efficiently. In fact, Keynes was more or less an economic planner himself. He was in bed. He was born to somewhat a family that was in bed with the British government. He wasn't he like knighted. So I mean, I'm not entirely sure about that one, but basically his entire life, he was very much the Keynes is sort of the epitome of the elitist sitting on academic tenure who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's also a pedophile, but that's another story.
I'm looking around for any reference to him being being knighted, and I can't find anything. But
I'm not entirely sure about that one, but I know that like after World War II, when the UN was basically trying to create the Bretton Woods Agreement to sort of band-aid the massive hole in the sort of political economic system worldwide that the Great Depression created. He was one of the economists that was representing the UK basically. So like the British government specifically was like using him as their policy advisor.
well, I mean that's fitting. Anyways, let's
Point though,
continue.
point though is that his entire career was basically just being a crony for the state, trying to pursue the state's interests.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, continuing here.
So we don't have to chuck capitalism in the bin. The trick is to tweak and reform it in intelligent ways.
Remember what I said earlier about if you substitute the word capitalism for government, everything that they say makes a bit more sense. We don't need to chuck government into the bin. We just need to tweak it and alter it in intelligent ways. Nothing really more to add about that. Just wanted to put that back in people's minds, into our audience's minds.
Likewise, I don't have anything to add either.
When people hear of options to adjust capitalism for the benefit of all, they tend to think, that sounds beautiful, but in the end, the freest variety that you find in the US will ultimately outcompete the others because it's just superior.
I mean, the idea that you can just tweak the government, or as the term that they'll use, capitalism, for the benefit of all. No, you're not going to be able to do that, especially not with central planning. You have, as pointed out multiple times by us and others, a fundamental class antagonism between the state, aka the organization that the central planners are going to necessarily have to be a part of in order to be able to do anything that they want, and the people that the economy is supposedly being centrally planned to the benefit of. So
You can
this idea is just absolute nonsense.
you can refute like 99% of the authoritarian arguments by simply invoking that class, that pointing out that the state is not this sort of interest neutral organization, that there is a political there's a political class of either business interests or people who run the state directly, who are either propped up by the state's legislative decrees, or are running the state. So they're the ones who directly benefit from how they attempt to engineer society. And given that this is a coherent organization of people that do have sort of continuity of financial interests, they're all going to sort of pursue the same things, and they're all going to sort of act the same way because they all have the same interests. So I guess that sort of itself can totally just poke a hole in the idea that this state will eventually be right, and this state will be virtuous and be nice to the people. The fact that you're even talking about the state in the way it's this sort of organization lording over people, which is sort of unavoidable even within statist rhetoric. The fact you're even talking about it that way is kind of an illustration of why exactly it never will be anything more than an antagonism to us.
Now I'm going to make a prediction here because I mean, I think this is going to be a very safe bet to make that they're going to argue about how central planners are great and wonderful and wise, and how any tweaking that they'll do will necessarily not only make capitalism safer and less predatory, but they'll also make it more profitable. Which, if that's the case, I don't understand why you would even need these people in the first place to essentially plan the
Well,
economy. And why don't they instead just go into the market and use their great, wonderful wisdom to just make themselves billionaires or freaking trillionaires, since they seem to know
even
how
if
to operate industry better than the people who are actually operating industry.
even if we were to ditch the class argument entirely, you would be left with the famous logical problem in this way of thinking. People are too dumb, so that's why the state needs to exist. The state is made up of people. What makes them any different?
Well, you see, the state is built on magic soil, which the moment you become a member of the state's ruling class, you automatically stop being dumb and you immediately become stricken with great, wonderful awareness, and you just become better than everyone else. You see, the state is this. Plato was right, only he wanted to prescribe the Gold Caste, the Philosopher Kings, as their own separate organization that would be, picked out from the smartest people in society. He didn't. What Plato failed to understand is that just by being rulers, they are automatically better than everyone else. They are more enlightened, and therefore they are a separate species of humanity entirely. They are, in fact, they are the Homo superior that the he's been wanting all this time.
Philosopher kings, you mean?
Yeah, philosopher kings. They are the philosopher kings, and
Even though,
the government magic just makes them better.
all right, I
And
guess we'll continue.
All right, well, let's go.
The argument goes like this. The US variety maximizes growth by minimizing the constraints on wealth creation, which creates higher inequality, but in the end makes everyone better off in absolute terms than under a more equal but less dynamic system. But if you look
It creates inequality to lower constraints. What?
I think what they're trying to say is that because there are fewer constraints on the ability of producers to create wealth and just generally to produce, that the result is greater inequality. But their argument they're going to try to paste over that is that because ultimately even workers are better off, that this is still beneficial to everyone. And now they're going to start to make an argument to refute that.
Okay, well, first of all, if we were to compare the U.S. to even the Scandinavian countries, that's as I was sort of talking about earlier, that's not even accurate. The U.S. is a lot closer to China, really, but just if we were to really get into that, it's weird because if more people had more access to more resources, there would be more wealth, which means that not only would more people have more resources, but their resources would be worth more. They would have more purchasing power. So I don't like this doesn't make any sense at all.
I'm pretty sure it's just Marxian class theory. They're going to start trying to appeal to that because even though they're not Marxists, they're technocrats. They have that kind of Marxian reflex that they just can't quite help but scratch. Anyway, should I continue?
I guess so, but we can address that if they get to it.
All right.
facts, it's overwhelmingly not true that the freer varieties of capitalism grow faster. From 1955 to 1980, the time when regulations were much stricter, the world economy grew 2.6% per year. For the next 30 years, the heyday of neoliberal economics, it grew at only 1.3%.
What?
And what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we're saying the world economy grew? Assuming we're talking about GDP.
I have so many questions. I don't know where to start. First off, where do you get the figure that the regulations were a lot more strict than the 1950s and the 1980s? Secondly, where the 2.6% figure come from? Is that equally distributed throughout the world, or is it just like huge amounts of growth in some areas but not in others? Was there recession in some areas? What is it that changed from 1980 onwards that caused it to become, neoliberal? What the hell does neoliberalism even mean? What even is neoliberalism? Again, how do you get that 1.3% figure? What the hell changed?
Also,
Was there suddenly a depletion of regulations throughout the world? Secondly, where are those? Is there an even distribution of regulations throughout the world? This is such absolute nonsensical drivel that I actually would be genuinely concerned if the person writing this they couldn't help just feel just I don't know about you, but I would just feel uncomfortable as hell writing that because I'd just be so confused about what the hell I was even saying.
not to mention that they apparently just undermined their concept of national political economies, which they were referring to earlier. Apparently, there's a world political economy and national ones, which that doesn't conflict necessarily. But if you're going to look at economies as things which are prescribed by the state, then yes, it does conflict because it means that the political economy is both national and international when it's supposed to be one or the other.
hmm Not to mention that there are a lot of places where GDP figures simply weren't counted until relatively recently. So you can imagine in certain places where GDP all of a sudden started being counted, that they would see a 100% growth rate. And I can imagine that in terms of global economy, that would probably contribute to the 2.6% figure. But again, like we don't know what the hell they're using, so we're just left completely in the dark. And I think you remember what I said last stream, where the moment that a person starts using the phrase neoliberal, that you know that they're trying to deceive you. Yeah,
Yeah,
they use the N word.
they use that N word at the same time that they begin talking even faster, no less,
hmm
about economic growth globally when that undermines several concepts they were trying to build up previously, but also raises a lot of questions in just one sentence, more or less.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat right now. Desert Dweller says neo means new or revived. Yeah, we know what the prefix means. It's just that the term neoliberal is so poorly defined that it's used to describe a whole lot of multiple and contradictory phenomena, in addition to being unable to be clearly defined or even described by even scholars who spend their careers attempting to describe it. I mentioned last stream that I have a video script written that I still haven't recorded yet for some reason about the
And we
about neoliberalism. And yeah, the scholars who research this topic have no freaking idea what that term means, and this
we
understanding is so pervasive that even they refer to the inability to describe neoliberalism in concrete terms as a cliche.
we understand like derivatives. We understand sort of like how it's defined, which by the way, definitions are descriptions, so they don't actually explain anything. So using a definition in response to somebody asking you to explain the validity of your concept doesn't check out logically. um but that's more or less what Heretic is asking, and what I am asking as well is, what exactly, on what grounds, does is neoliberalism justified as a concept? And given that it's not entirely clear, and nor could it ever be clear, what neoliberalism is even referring to, because it refers to a whole bunch of different ideas. It presupposes a whole bunch of things about those areas of study, which contradict each other and aren't justified and can't really ever be justified, due to how neoliberalism is also it's framed as a description of certain principles or axioms. What we're arguing is that it's not really it's an anti-concept, basically.
Which is funny because JC Armitage in the comments was actually directly asking, is neoliberalism an anti-concept? And yeah, you just answered that.
Okay.
Anyways, continuing here.
In its miracle growth periods between 1958 and 1982, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan had governments hell-bent on dictating business activities, and it worked rather well for them. Contrary to the popular belief that a large welfare state is bad for economic
Worked
growth.
well.
That's just vague. That's just vague language. That's just
Yeah,
used to give people. It's used to poison the well and give a very flowery impression in people's minds. So when they start to throw around terms that have no context and phrase and statistics that have no meaning, then people will be less inclined to question them and the point that they're about to bring
it's
up.
really bizarre when, because you hear this a lot from statists when they're trying to describe different ways of approaching the study of society. I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this stream have probably heard this one before. Anarchy or libertarianism doesn't work. That's an incoherent response, because libertarianism is a social study. Anarchy it's a claim about the nature of social organization. So sort of like what makes Austrians different from the economic mainstream. We don't make prescriptions about society. We argue that certain traits of the state's existence are incoherent, and the claims about ethics and property, for instance, we put forward, are guides for what specifically we need to do in order to subvert the state's influence over society and arrive at these ethical outcomes where people could actually defend their rights consistently.
Hmm. And I just brought it back. Freaking hell! I got something in my throat. Well, I brought back the timer to show those examples before because someone in the chat pointed out something that's very interesting. That the three examples that they used are, well, they're zombie economies. Japan did feed its growth on the basis of like loose monetary policy and just generally trying to stimulate the economy as much as possible to create meteoric growth, and it did work. Naturally, when you flood the economy with easy cash, to say that it won't create economic growth would I think would be fairly silly. But the result has been that they've been in a zombie economy since the 80s and have largely just been stagnant to the point where in order to in order to survive, just to eke out a relatively modest and what we would consider in the US to be an impoverished standard of living, you have to be working for like 16 hours a day every for 5 or 6 days a week. And it
Their
gets even
central bank, their central bank openly buys stocks.
Mhm.
That should tell you everything
And
about the Japanese
we got a super
economy.
chat from Cyan. He says, "I don't hate you."
Okay. I don't hate you either. I don't know what that's about, but all
Yeah,
right.
he gave us £2.
Nice.
Thank you for the donation. And yes, don't worry, we don't hate you. Uh, we he's also in the comments like being asking us what the hell is this? Please, or asking me to explain myself. He'll need to be a bit more specific, but he kind of showed up like at the tail end of the stream, so I don't know where to begin. But yeah, the same thing is true with South Korea. I don't know as much about that, but I do know that for a long time they had a military dictatorship and have only just like been relatively recently started to grow. But even then, like they kind of have the same problem that Japan has, where their economy is becoming particularly stagnant, and well, people need to work 16 hours a day for 6 to 7 work weeks to make their ends meet. It's absolutely horrendous. And then you have Taiwan, which I'm going to be honest, I don't really know that much about. But I do know that this video is going to be demonetized in China. So for mentioning Taiwan's existence. So chances are that this video is not long for YouTube anymore. And we have a guy in the comments named Super N Word who asks if we like libertarianism. I mean, we're libertarians, so yeah.
Would I say that I like it? I mean, it explains more than pretty much any other approach to social study, talking about the structure of societies and how people associate with one another and build conventions within those societies, which very few people are actually aware of the philosophical side of libertarianism, unfortunately. But that is what libertarianism is,
All right.
and yeah, I wouldn't say I like it. I just find it to be true. I don't really know if you could say that you like something because you argue that it's legitimate.
All right. Well, anyways, I know this is kind of abrupt, but I do gotta get going now, so we're gonna have to cut the stream short here. We're not. I know we're not halfway into the video, but yeah, still.
But we seem to be just going in circles, and it seems like before you cut off the video, they were about to attempt to make the case about the welfare state that I just argued earlier that they can't. That the welfare state is virtuous and helps give people wealth when in reality it works as a passive subsidy for the state's political partners.
It also entraps people into belief or into conflating the state with their own personal well-being and their own personal interests, which,
It
yeah, I think
also
we've
makes
talked about that to death.
another way in which it benefits the state's political partners is because, in order to sign up for welfare programs, in a lot of cases, you have to associate with like particular banks and you have to set up like certain types of accounts in those banks. So it works as a subsidy for the banks too, to make people dependent on them.
Yeah, I love banks. Anyways, yeah, we're gonna end the stream here. Thanks everyone for stopping by. We're gonna be doing the next stream will be next Wednesday, and we'll be bringing Radical Reviewer back to talk about a PragerU video. That'll be fun.
Hopefully, I'll have my upcoming essay up by then, which I don't think it's going to happen by the end of this week, but it is going to be pretty nice when it's up.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next week. Bye.